And I want to broaden the question out a little bit to think about what Brexit actually means for the future of liberal democracy in Europe. Somebody told me a joke a couple of months ago, which reminded me of the kind of jokes that my grandfather would tell me, who grew up in socialist Poland, and I never thought that they were particularly funny, and I never thought they were particularly relevant. But suddenly they seem to have a renewed bitterness to them. So it's very short. It's you're back in the Soviet Union, and a man is walking home from work late at night, and he sees some other guy on the side of the road throwing up into the gutter, very drunk. And he walks over and he puts his hand on his shoulder and he says, "I completely agree with your analysis, comrade." So that's how I've been feeling, and I've been trying to make sense of that analysis. So I think there's a big empirical puzzle and there's a big normative puzzle about what's going on in the world at the moment. The empirical puzzle is that we used to think that wealthy democracies are stable. That once you're relatively wealthy, more than about $15,000 GDP per capita, which is what Argentina had in 1989, the wealthiest seemingly established democracy ever to collapse. If you've had a couple of peaceful turnovers of government, you're fine. You no longer have to worry. And one way that is cashed out by political scientists is that democratic consolidation is a one-way street. That once you've consolidated, there's no real going back from that. Often there was this phrase in the literature and political science that democracy would become the only game in town. And once it's the only game in town, it's there to stay. And in a broader sense, thinking about Europe, there was an assumption that the basic sort of political order we're in would remain stable, that perhaps the European Union would continue to evolve, to continue to integrate, but there too there would be no going backward. Well, in various ways, recent events have called this into doubt. The most obvious one, sorry to give you a fright, is Brexit. But obviously since then, it's also the election of Donald Trump in the United States. So what we've seen is the rise of these illiberal populists across North America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and beyond. The rapid erosion of core democratic norms. And speaking of Brexit, a surprisingly large shift in the basic political order in Europe. And we're going to see whether that just will remain limited to Britain or whether it'll spread beyond that as well. And one, speaking at an academic conference, one sort of puzzle here is that political scientists and more broadly social scientists really haven't figured out how to reflect this view yet, either in the vocabulary or in the empirical assumptions. And so, for example, key empirical indicators like the Freedom House or the Polity scores haven't really changed. So they're supposed to measure how democratic a country is, in some ways how secure democracy is. But when you look at what they're saying about France, the United States, Great Britain, they're exactly the same as they were 5 years ago. And for these places certainly still are liberal democracies. Something in these countries has changed, and the language we speak in political science can't express that for now. So I think there's an empirical puzzle here, how to make sense of that. But then there's, so we need a new measure, I argue, of the robustness of liberal democracy. That's one of the things we have to do. But there's also a larger conceptual puzzle. We used to think that liberalism and democracy are mutually reinforcing, but they go together in a kind of natural way. But now they increasingly seem to be falling apart, in part because of figures like Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, who represent this wider movement of illiberal Democrats who have taken power in a number of countries in Europe now and seem to be on the cusp of taking power in other countries. But at the same time, there's a sort of converse development, which is a little different, which is that many citizens see their systems as less and less democratic, and that obviously included citizens thinking of the European Union as undemocratic, which was one of the drivers and one of the talking points of the Brexit campaign. And so I think we need a new conceptual framework that can better capture the rapid transformations that are now taking place and that can understand how liberalism and democracy may in some ways be in tension with each other. All right, so let's start with the empirical puzzle. Things like the Polity and the Freedom House measures, which are so key to political science, try to measure the extent of democratic rule, looking at questions like whether elections are free and fair today, looking at questions like whether there's independent courts, whether there's freedom of the press, and measuring those things. And they're very good at doing that particular thing. But I think we also need a measure of what I call democratic deconsolidation. We can no longer assume that democracies will always be the only game in town. We can no longer assume that once you're consolidated, you're safe. We have to be open to the possibility that democratic consolidation is no longer a one-way street. And so I set out with a colleague, Roberto Stefanfoa, to try and measure the robustness of democratic rule, to figure out how we measure whether or not we can be confident that our countries will remain democracies. And if you're thinking about democratic consolidation as democracy being the only game in town, there's sort of three logical ways of thinking about ways in which it might cease to be the only game in town. One is that support for democracy as a regime form may be decreasing. The second is that there may be increasing openness to authoritarian alternatives to democracy. And the third is that you may see the rise of anti-system parties and movements that disrespect core democratic norms and have a growing share of the vote, are capturing more and more offices. And I want to argue today that these three things are actually going on. So here, for example, you see quite clearly a growing share of citizens who are dissatisfied with democracy. When we ask people, is democracy a bad or very bad way of running the country? The share of people who say this has gone up, both in Europe, this is the black line, the dotted line earlier and then the black line above, and even more clearly in the United States. You can see again the dotted line earlier in 1995, and then a much higher line in 2011. Even more shockingly, younger citizens ascribe a lot less importance to living in a democracy than they used to. So the most interesting curve here is the dark one for the United States. You see that over 2/3 of people born in the 1930s and the 1940s said that living in a democracy is essential to me, 10 out of 10, really important. Once you get to millennials born since 1980, it is less than 1/3. So it's halved in these relative decades. And this is actually a global trend that goes beyond the United States. So here you see that same curve for the United States on the far left, and you see strikingly similar curves in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Great Britain, in Australia, in New Zealand, in all of these pretty different countries across the world. And it's a trend that holds basically in all of the really long-standing, established democracies, blue chip democracies, where we might think we needn't be worried about. Even more strikingly, support for authoritarian alternatives to democracy is rising. So when you compare the answers of people 20 years ago and today, in terms of how many people think that having the army rule is a good system of government, you see a couple of countries decreasing, especially in a place like Spain, where we had essentially a form of military government for a long time, but in most countries it is going up, quite clearly in the US, in Great Britain, in Sweden, in Germany, and so on. And finally, we don't have to dwell on this because we all know this, the share of anti-system parties in the political system is also going up. So this is just a comparison of voting intentions over the last 3 years, and even within these 3 years, you see all of these far-right populist and other forms of authoritarian parties rising quite rapidly over the course of that time period. If you had a 15-20-year curve, you would see an even more radical shift. And so taking these things together, it becomes very clear that key indicators suggest that global democracies in North America and Western Europe are now deconsolidating. But the question then becomes whether that actually means that democracy has become less robust in these countries. Are the indicators that we're looking at actually predictive of a subsequent deterioration in democratic rule? Well, there's not much evidence for this. We haven't seen the phenomenon of democratic deconsolidation in these blue chip democracies before. We're now in a new world. But some case studies suggest that we should be very worried indeed. And perhaps the most interesting one in the European context is Poland. Poland was the great success story of post-communist transition. It's the one country that most political scientists considered to be consolidated, and they considered it to be consolidated for pretty good reasons. It has had 5 peaceful turnovers of government since 1990 for free and fair elections. It has a very robust civil society, with lots of associations and NGOs and all of that nice stuff. It's had a very good and critical media that's held governments to account, that isn't afraid to report about governments critically. And it's had very strong economic performance. Its GDP per capita has increased by something like 5 or 6-fold since 1990. And yet, we now see Poland rapidly veering away from liberal democracy since electing the peace government under Kaczynski's ideological guidance last year. There's been concerted attacks on the Constitutional Court. There's been very clear attacks on the free media. There's been attacks on the political neutrality of the state bureaucratic institutions. And so taking all of this together, it's quite clear that liberal democracy seems to be eroding in Poland at the moment. Guy Verhofstadt, for example, who was very involved in the accession talks for Poland, said that it's very clear that Poland today would not be admitted to the European Union. Well, could our indicators of democratic deconsolidation have predicted this? Is this something that 10 or 15 years ago we might have been able to see that there's trouble brewing in Poland? Yes, when you go back 10 or 15 years, 1 in 6 polls said that democracy is a bad or very bad way of running the country, much higher than other European countries at the time, and at similar levels to what we're seeing now in more brutal democracies. 1 in 5 people said that military rule was a good system of government, much higher than other countries at the time, and similar levels to what we're seeing now in blue chip democracies. And there was then a strong presence of anti-system parties, from PiS to Samoa and other movements, and again, that is what we're seeing now in liberal democracies. I could go into similar case studies in Latin America, like Venezuela, and of course there is every possibility that 4 or 5 years ago I may be able to add a 3rd case study to this list. So I think there is strong evidence that democratic deconsolidation is happening and is a good predictor of future slides in the extent of democratic rule. And that is very much the context in which we should see Brexit and the rise of far-right populist parties in Europe. But it raises a conceptual question. What is the nature of liberal democracy? Where is liberal democracy going? How do we understand that its 2 component elements seem to be getting into conflict with each other? Well, I think it's helpful to remember that liberalism and democracy don't go naturally together. They're really 2 distinct concepts. And how we can think about the world when we start to separate those concepts. So what do I mean by liberalism? Quite straightforwardly, a set of institutions that effectively protect civil liberties and minority rights. And what do I mean by democracy? I give a very minimalist definition of democracy, precisely because we normally bake in elements of liberalism into democracy, but when we pry them apart, we can give a much more straightforward definition of democracy. So I call it simply a set of electoral institutions that effectively translate popular views into public policy. And my fear is that these 2 components are now starting to drift apart. What do I mean by that? Well, let's start with liberal democracy. Canada is a nice example of a liberal democracy. What happens when you become less liberal? Well, using the political scientist's favorite tool, which is the 2x2, we can go to the right of this little graph, go more illiberal, and we end up with an illiberal democracy, right? Something like Hungary, a place where the people's views are very directly expressed in politics, but the rights of minority and other groups are increasingly ignored. Well, we can also go in a different direction, so going back to liberal democracy, we can also go down, make the country less democratic, and that's what I would call undemocratic liberalism, a place in which rights are very well preserved, but the mechanism for translating popular views into public policies has either broken down or is relatively weak. And I'm going to argue that the European Union in many ways was and is a form of undemocratic liberalism. But we have elements of undemocratic liberalism in the United States and in other countries as well. This is by no means something that is exclusive to the European Union. It's a wider phenomenon of how our governance structure works. And then what happens when a country becomes not liberal and not democratic? Does somebody have a guess? Russia, and that's it's a dictatorship, right? So I think it's helpful to think of these four regime forms. So let me say a little bit about illiberal democracy and a little bit about undemocratic liberalism. So you've seen this rise of far-right populism, and why do we call it illiberal? Well, it's illiberal because it sets its political energies against ethnic and religious minorities, and it's illiberal because at the same time it sets itself against liberal institutions. It doesn't just say we don't like these immigrants, we don't like these Muslims, in Britain perhaps we don't like these Poles. It also says if a court ruling is telling us that we can't pursue these policies, or tries to say that there's a center of power other than the executive, then there's something wrong with this and we have to undermine that. And a striking example of this, which you referenced earlier, was when the British court decided that actually Parliament has to authorize Theresa May pulling Article 50. The British press, in a pure populist mode, went wild and called these judges the enemies of the people. This is as pure an expression of the populist idea of the people and of illiberal democracy as you can find. But I think it's also important to realize that a lot of this energy is in fact democratic, that it's helpful to understand that it has a democratic impulse. It's different from early generations of the far right, which were much more hierarchical and which had real nostalgia for pre-democratic systems of government in their symbols, in their rhetoric. That is not, by and large, true of a new crop of far-right populist parties in Europe. And one really striking thing is the emphasis they put on referendum. So when I was traveling for some research in Germany in March, I went to spend a little bit of time with Frauke Petri at her campaign events. And I was struck by the extent to which the AfD emphasizes the need for referenda. The story very broadly was, in 1948, they gave us a promise in the Grundgesetz that we would get a law on how to carry out elections and a law on popular referendum. They gave us the law on electing MPs, but they never gave us the law on national referenda. So we're a semi-democracy. And we have to become a full democracy by allowing national referenda. Why are they saying that? Because the first national referenda are going to go against freedom of religion for Muslims, against immigration, and they think, probably quite rightly, that they have a majority of people on their side. So there is something democratic to this movement. It's important to understand that, I think. On the other side, you have what I call undemocratic liberalism. Well, so if democracy is a way of translating popular views into public policies, there's two ways in which that can cease being the case. The first of them is that a lot of policy areas are taken out of democratic contestation, taken from democratic institutions to ones that are insulated from popular input. Well, the role of constitutional courts has increased a lot over the last 30 or 40 years, especially in Europe. The United States is a more complicated case, but certainly in Britain, in France, and so on, it has clearly increased. You see the rise of independent central banks, which in many countries used to be subject to political will to a large degree, but have now been taken out of democratic contestation. You see the role of bureaucratic agencies shifting. Max Weber said that bureaucratic agencies apply laws to particular cases. That's no longer what bureaucratic agencies do. Something like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Protection Bureau, which do great work, are really setting policy. We're not just applying cases. They are in certain ways making a form of law themselves. And that's true in places like Great Britain with quangos and with the European Commission as well. And then you have broad international organizations like the UN and so on, and you have trade treaties, which again constrain political space. So taking all of these things together, there's a lot of policy areas that have actually been taken out of democratic contestation. And the second point is that even legislatures no longer reflect popular views as well as they used to. There's complex reasons I'm not going to go into in great detail today, but it has something to do with campaign finance and the way that politics is run these days. It's something to do with the rise of lobbyists. So in Brussels, for example, there's about 500 lobbyists in the 1970s. Now there's about 30,000. And when you take these things together, I think there's also a sociological argument here. You had social democratic parties in Europe that had real sociological links in the working class movement and have now largely become distinct from those. But when you take all of these things together, legislatures no longer reflect popular views as much as they used to. So what does all of that mean? I'm about to finish, but I just want to express some of the fears I have for the future, and these are necessarily speculative because we're not there yet. But that is some of the things that I think we may be getting to. So the first is the danger of a vicious cycle. That as you have institutions insulating themselves from popular input, people feeling that they're being ignored in politics, they have more and more anger and more of an incentive to say, well, let's elect some radical people who are going to go in and smash the system. And at the same time, political elites quite reasonably look at the kinds of people who are getting elected and the kinds of outcomes that come from popular referenda at the moment and say, well, why on earth should we let these people smash the system and do all of these dangerous things? Perhaps we have to insulate the political system more and more. And so I think you get this reinforcing cycle between illiberal democracy and undemocratic liberalism. And you could imagine some pretty wild swings of the pendulums between these two new regime forms over time. So that's one fear. The other fear is that I do think illiberal democracy has a deeply democratic energy at the beginning, but that doesn't mean that it can be sustained. Any government becomes unpopular at some point, and when this is a government that has made its bread and butter by victimizing outsiders, and it's often a growing list of outsiders, and by sweeping aside independent power centers, then it's quite likely that it may turn into a dictatorship. And that's what we've seen in Russia. That's what we're seeing today in Turkey. And I think it's a really open question to what degree people in Hungary and Poland will ever again enjoy truly free and fair elections if the governing parties end up being unpopular. So there's a fear that even though the energy behind this is in some ways democratic, illiberal democracy does deteriorate into a form of dictatorship. And lastly, this is really purely speculative. I don't think we're anywhere close to that, but it is something that I could imagine developing, that you might increasingly have forms of undemocratic liberalism devolve into soft forms of dictatorship as well. But as they get more and more embattled, you start to say, well, why not ban the party that's trying to overturn the system? Why not defend ourselves against these illiberal energies, and slowly some of the liberalism in the system goes out because certain forms of protest are outlawed, certain parties are outlawed. That's very speculative, but I think that's one of the fears that we should conceive of as well. So just to sum up, I think that indicators of democratic deconsolidation are actually strong predictors of a deterioration in democratic rule. Even countries like the United States and France now appear to be deconsolidating. Wealthy liberal democracies may no longer be as stable as they once were. And so there's a risk that liberal democracy may slowly be giving way to new regime forms. What do we do about that? Well, I think there's a form of Sophie's choice. I'm not willing to sacrifice liberalism. I'm not willing to sacrifice democracy either. And so in order to reconcile the two, we need to first figure out what the causes of a crisis of liberal democracy are, and actually have real policy change that addresses the concerns that people have, that addresses the drivers of the anger of people in order to find possible remedies. And that is essentially what I do in the latter parts of the book that I'm now writing about the crisis of liberal democracy. Thank you very much.